May I introduce my colleague,
Jan van der Muller, very good to meet you. Hello. Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
He's the only colleague who can speak German.
Hello. Michael Xiao,
Very good
moderator.
Thank you.
Good. How to pronounce correctly? Müller.
Yeah, that's
Müller.
That's perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
那你待会儿请你介绍。
You don't mind me getting up? You don't mind me getting up later on? As opposed to sitting.
Yes, it's fine. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm glad to open this keynote speech. It is the fourth keynote speech for the Taiwan Sociological Association, but actually it's part of a workshop that we had planned to organize in parallel with the Taiwan Sociological Association. And this international workshop on populism, Taiwan and Asia within world trends. As you may know, populism has been striking many countries, but Taiwan is a little bit kind of late in this global trend. So we thought interesting to raise this topic. And we are very fortunate to have the pleasure to invite Professor Jan Werner Müller from Princeton University. In 2016, he wrote a book, first in German, I think, and then it was published in English, What is Populism? And this book has been translated in, you said 25 languages? Yeah, including Chinese. The Chinese version was published in Taiwan last year, I think. So it's Taiwanese Chinese, well, Chinese from Taiwan. And okay, so just for you who are very interested by this topic, just I mention now that we will continue the workshop at 2 o'clock, but it will be on 8th floor to have a smaller room. But Professor Müller will not use PowerPoint, but if you need a written support, which sometimes is useful, you can download it from our website. There is a website for the conference. It's on. You go to. If you Google the title of the conference, you will find the website. And Professor Müller's paper is on the page. Now I would like to ask Professor Michael Xiao, our colleague at the Institute of Sociology, to kindly chair this keynote speech. Thank you very much.
Okay, good day and welcome to this special keynote speech, a part of this TSA 2019 annual conference. And this is special. Well, it's a special ordinary. Keynote speech is an activity organized by the TRT, Thematic Research Team on Social Transformation of Asia. Academic Syndicat Institute of Sociology is one of the 6 or 7 thematic team. And we are very happy to have Professor Müller to come to give a talk on the global wave of populism. Be careful with question mark. And then the previous announcement is different. They have a more connotation, a threat or crisis, But there's no crisis, no threat, but with question mark. That implication is quite clear. So we will use how much time? How is the arrangement?
You're the boss. Maybe around
40 minutes?
Sure. 40 minutes.
40 minutes, and then on the list, I'm required to also serve as a discussant. But I think it's a keynote speech. You don't discuss, you reflect. So I will reflect 3 to 5 minutes, and we open for discussion. I'm sure you have more questions than I do. I read already. So my question will keep to myself, and I will reflect continuously. So that'll be good. So 40 minutes for you, and then we open the floor, because we will finish by 1:40. And this is very jam-packed, back to back. Okay, let's welcome Professor Müller.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored and humbled to have been invited to a gathering, a workshop of sociologists. As you can tell from the fact that I don't have a PowerPoint, I'm not really a social scientist. I'm just a political theorist, political theory being the last area in social science departments where you can get away with not having a PowerPoint. But I'm hoping that perhaps some interesting discussions or frictions will come out of a confrontation between a perhaps more conceptual and also more normative approach and then some more social science-oriented approaches as well. If I may, I'll actually get up. I'll, so to speak, come closer to the people, if I may. And I start out with the observation that, as you all know, our age is characterized by an absolutely inflationary use of the word populism. All kinds of political actors, from the left to the right, are nowadays labeled as populists. Usually it's implied that somehow, because they're populists, they might be dangerous for democracy. But even somebody, in a sense, seemingly as innocent as poor Emmanuel Macron, at one point during the 2017 presidential election in France, was accused of being a populist. It was said in France at the time that he might be a populist of the extreme center, whatever that exactly was supposed to have meant. Moreover, as you also all know, media commentary nowadays is dominated by one particular image, one particular metaphor, which allegedly holds the key to understanding our times. It's, of course, the image, the metaphor of the seemingly unstoppable wave of populism. One of the papers for this workshop actually cites some commentary in Japan, which, if I remember correctly, asked the question, so has the populist wave now reached Taiwan or not? As if this was the obvious question to ask in terms of political analysis today. Ladies and gentlemen, I find this image profoundly misleading, and I'd say a few words about why I find it so misleading towards the end of my remarks this afternoon. But before doing that, allow me first to give an answer to the much contested question, what is populism anyway? Please note that what I'll try to do in that, so to speak, first chapter of my remarks is to offer you not so much a definition, but a kind of ideal type. Note also that, for the moment at least, I'm not trying to offer you any kind of explanation or any kind of story about what may or may not have, as the phrase goes, caused populism. In a second step, in a second chapter if you like, I'll try to say a few words about what populists actually do when they get into power. I'll try to convince you that by now we can speak of a distinct populist art of governance, that there are patterns of what these actors do when they get into government, which we recognize in a whole range of rather different settings and countries. And then lastly, I'll get to the question of whether there really is a wave and whether the whole framing of wave, global trend, etc. is really all that useful. So, first chapter, what is populism anyway? Of course, the conventional wisdom in our era is that anybody who criticizes elites, or who, as an equally cliched expression goes, is angry with the establishment, is therefore automatically a populist. Seems completely obvious, but when you think about it, it's actually a very strange thought. Up until quite recently, any old civics textbook would have told us that being critical with the powerful, keeping a close eye on the powerful, is actually a sign of being a good citizen, is a sign of good democratic engagement. All of a sudden, come the early 21st century, we're told day and night that anybody who is too critical somehow with elites is probably a populist who is dangerous for democracy. Clearly, ladies and gentlemen, things cannot be as simple as that. It's true that populists, when they are in opposition, tend to criticize, well, sitting governments and also usually other parties. And in that simple sense, yes, are critical of elites. But my proposition is that they also always do something else. They always claim, in one form or another, that they, and only they, represent what populists typically call the real people, or also the silent majority. My hand waving is supposed to signal quotation marks around these expressions. Now you might say, well, that's not so bad. Why is this, automatically dangerous for democracy? Plus, this clearly isn't the same as, certain phenomena which are frequently mentioned in connection with populism today. Racism, protectionism in trade, or in the European context, maybe fanatical hatred of European integration. It's none of that on the face of it. And yet, this claiming, if you like, of a monopoly of representing the real people always does have two, for democracy, detrimental, that is to say, negative consequences. First, and rather obviously, populists then also claim that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate. Note that this is never just a disagreement about policy or even about values, which after all is completely normal, ideally even productive in a democracy. No, in a certain way, populists always immediately make it personal, and they make it entirely moral. The others, so the usual claim goes, are simply all corrupt or, to coin a phrase, crooked characters. What the current president of the United States did in the election campaign 2015-2016 was, of course, in many ways extreme. But as far as populism is concerned, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think it was an exception. My proposition to you is that all populists talk the kind of way that he ended up talking about his opponents. Second, and maybe somewhat less obvious consequence, populists are also going to claim that all those among the citizens themselves, among the people itself, if you like, who do not share their ultimately symbolic construction of the allegedly real people, and hence logically also don't support the populists politically, that with all these citizens, you can put into doubt whether they truly belong to the people at all. Let me try to illustrate this perhaps less self-evident thought with two examples. One is again from my current president. In May 2016, then candidate Trump gave a speech which went utterly unnoticed given all the other interesting things he was saying during the campaign. But it was a speech that in one sense turned out to be deeply revealing. He said, and I'm quoting from memory, the most important thing is the unification of the people. And all the other people don't mean anything. I hope you can see where this is going. The populace decides who the real people are and who is not part of the real people. And whether you happen to legally belong, whether you happen to have, in this case, an American passport, that's not the decisive criterion of being part of the real people. In short, not all citizens are part of the real people. Second example, at the end of the memorable, for many people still today, quite traumatic night of Brexit, Nigel Farage gave a speech where he said, that the outcome of the referendum had been, as he put it, a victory for real people. Implying, of course, that the 48% of Brits who wanted to stay inside the European Union, well, on one level, aren't quite real, are not properly part of the British, or maybe in the case of Farage, specifically the English people. I hope you can see where all this is going. The important thing about populism is not anti-elitism per se. Any of us can criticize the powerful. Doesn't mean we're automatically right, but it's also not something that is automatically a peril, a danger for democracy. And quite possibly the opposite is the case. What is distinctive and so dangerous about populism is, for shorthand, anti-pluralism. It's the tendency of populists always to exclude others, obviously at the level of party politics, less obviously at the level of, if you like, the people themselves, where usually it's already vulnerable minorities who are going to be excluded in one form or another. Notice one conceptual implication of this account. If you find any of this even remotely convincing, then please note that all I've said so far is not directly linked to any particular policy position. So when nowadays people always say things like, oh, you know, populism is winning because people are adopting this policy or that policy, I think they're not doing us a favor in terms of understanding certain contemporary developments. At least from within my framework, if you find anything worthwhile in it, you can't really call policies as such populist or non-populist. And I think it's actually been a problem for much of our political analysis that because we're told day and night that, oh, we now live in the age of populism, that we label certain phenomena as populist, even though we often have much more precise concepts. Concepts like nativism, racism, protectionism, all kinds of isms that actually capture certain policy positions much better. Now, to be sure, I wouldn't deny that there can be an elective affinity, if you like, between what I'm describing as this claim to a moral monopoly of representation on the one hand, and then certain policy positions on the other. I'm not saying it's a total accident that, let's say, right-wing populists in many parts of the world also end up with a particular policy position on, let's say, immigration or refugee policies. But I think it's important to keep these different phenomena prima facie apart, because at most there's an elective affinity, and they don't necessarily all entail each other. Notice also, just to address one other thing that in my view tends to often go wrong today with political analysis, notice also that nationalism is not automatically the same as populism. Again, it's not an accident that so many right-wing populists in the world today are also nationalists. After all, if they talk about the real people, they have to explain who the real people are. They need to sort of fill that idea with some concrete content. And in many cases, the nation is the most obvious thing to draw on. But you can be a populist without being a nationalist. And conversely, you can be a nationalist, you can give supreme moral significance, or even just some moral significance, to national borders and nationality as a principle, without thereby becoming at the same time a populist. So that's just a couple of conceptual implications that I want to put on the table, maybe for further discussion later on. Allow me also to draw out one other, in a sense, more concrete political implication that might be of interest to discuss. If you, again, find anything remotely plausible about what I've been trying to put on the table so far, you might ask the question, well, what about populists who lose elections? Don't they have a massive problem in terms of, on the one hand, claiming that they and only they represent the people, and on the other hand, not actually succeeding at the ballot box, or let's say even if they succeed, not actually winning an overwhelming majority? That seems to pose a pretty significant contradiction for actors like that. And it certainly does. And it's therefore, I think, not an accident that very often, I underline very often, I'm not saying this is a regularity that you're going to find in every single instance, but very often, when populists lose at the ballot box, something very specific happens. What these actors often tend to then do is to basically suggest that we take a second look at that infamous formula of the silent majority. According to the logic of the populists themselves, if the majority is not silent, they will always already be in government. If they're in government, if they don't succeed, it must logically mean that someone or something has silenced the majority. Therefore, it's not an accident that very often, not always, very often, in cases where populists lose, they start to gesture at basically conspiracy theories, according to which something or someone, well, guess who, liberal elites, must have been manipulating things behind the scenes to prevent the people from truly expressing themselves. Again, the US perhaps is the most obvious example in this regard. Many of you will remember how candidate Trump in November 2016, when asked whether he would accept a win by Hillary Clinton, basically said, well, I'll tell you at the time. But of course, everybody knew what that meant. And in case there was any doubt, you all know that ever since, he has basically, even though he won, made claims that he even won the popular vote. That because all these illegals were voting, even that stuff about 3 million more votes for Hillary than for Trump isn't really true. And in more recent periods, you will recall the local election, the mayoral election in Istanbul earlier this year, when the AKP lost. The first claim was there must have been fraud. This cannot truly be correct. Now, of course, some of you may also then say, but look, eventually Erdogan did concede. That's also true, but notice maybe just as a small empirical footnote to the story, which is nowadays often celebrated as, oh, look, populists, they haven't locked down everything, they can still be beaten. Yes, correct, but notice the slight detail that the government in Turkey immediately proceeded to take away as many powers as possible from İmamoğlu, i.e. the winning candidate, who's now the mayor of Istanbul. Anyway, all I want to point to is that even when populists actually don't win, there is potentially damage to a democratic political culture. Because if they do what I've just described to you, what they end up, in effect, suggesting to their followers is that our institutions, well, are profoundly corrupt, are rotten, can't be trusted. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't criticize our democratic institutions or our election systems, especially, but not only in the United States. As you all know, there's plenty to criticize. But there's a difference between somebody who, for instance, takes issue with existing campaign finance regulations and somebody who ends up saying, because I didn't win, our system is rotten. The first one is a democratic stance. The second one is a populist and is not a democratic stance. And what kind of rhetoric losers ultimately employ makes a big difference for the health of a democratic political culture overall. All right, quickly on to my second chapter. What do populists do when they get into power? I partly bring this up because it seems to me that there is still a very widespread view among liberals in the broadest possible sense that almost by definition populists cannot really govern. Why? Because liberals in the broadest sense often assert all populists are anti-elitists. Once they get into government, they themselves have become the elite. By definition, they cannot keep up an anti-elitist discourse. So, problem solves itself. Or a variation of some liberal ideas in this regard, all populists are totally irresponsible demagogues. They always promise people whatever they want to hear, and of course none of these promises can really be made good on in government, so on day 2 of their time in office becomes blindingly obvious to everybody that no wall actually gets built, no trade agreement is going to get renegotiated, and so on and so forth. So either followers lose faith in the populist leader because the promises aren't being kept, or Populist leaders actually become pragmatic, they moderate, they actually take care of, real problems. Basically the old moderation through inclusion hypothesis in political science. And, once you let them govern, things are going to calm down, people won't have time to kind of worry all that much about ideological doctrines and purity, and they actually solve real problems in one form or another. In both cases, the implication is clearly that the problem is going to solve itself in one way or another. So not to worry when populists come to power. This is a very comforting view. I think it's also profoundly mistaken. I think we have enough examples just in our era to see that populists are perfectly capable of governing, and more important still, they're perfectly capable of governing as populists, which is to say, as actors who on a fundamental level do not recognize the legitimacy of an opposition. And that stance translates into what earlier on I tried to suggest to you we may as well call a particular populist art of governance. And if I may, I'll just run through a couple of core elements of this art. Again, on a methodological note, I'm not suggesting that everything that I'm about to say can be perfectly found in, let's say, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, India, the Philippines, Venezuela, and so on. I'm talking about something that's much more like a family resemblance, where you can say, look, ultimately, these regimes do belong to each other. They do belong to one political family, but it doesn't mean that everything is totally identical in what, after all, are very different local and national settings. Okay, concretely, what are we talking about? Well, first, and probably most obviously, when populists in power face criticism by independent institutions, be it courts or be it free media, they will respond to that criticism with the claim, well, who elected you? We, and only we, are the representatives of the people. This, ladies and gentlemen, is by no means new. Napoleon III in the 19th century also already pretty much, countered a critical press by saying, you are a non-legitimate, non-elected rival to the elected authorities. So I'm not saying that this populist art of governance is something that, is total innovation in our era. Some of it is very recognizable. That probably is also true for the second element I would submit to you, which essentially consists in the tendency of these populist governments, if they have enough power, to, so to speak, occupy or hijack the state itself. By which I mean that they will try to replace what, at least in theory, should be a neutral civil service, a neutral bureaucracy, with partisan actors. Now, many of you might say, well, look, I can think of plenty of political parties that try to do that. This is not particularly populist. It's also not particularly new, for sure. Absolutely correct. The difference, though, I would say, is that according to their own logic, populists here are doing something which certainly doesn't have to be hidden in any shape or form, but actually has to be done very openly and done with a kind of moral justification. Remember their core claim: we and only we represent the real people. Who does the state exist for? Well, for the people, of course. So if the party of the populists takes possession of the state, that's not something to be ashamed of. That's how things should be. Secondly, beyond that, there's also what for shorthand we might call mass clientelism, i.e. the tendency to basically give benefits and bureaucratic favors to those who support the regime. Again, many of you are going to say, well, look, I can think of a million examples of patronage politics. This is not particularly populist. There's so many examples of parties that try to do this. Again, absolutely correct as an empirical observation. Again, I would point to one possible difference, which is that populists can again do this very openly and with what in their mind is probably a moral justification. For remember that from the get-go, not all citizens are the people. Only some citizens are the people. And then if only some citizens get these benefits, that's not something that's vaguely illegitimate or has to be hidden. That's actually how things ought to be. This, by the way, just as a footnote for some of you, seems to me also a rather plausible explanation for something that otherwise is really, really hard to make sense of. I'm talking about the fact that in a number of prominent cases, populists when in opposition, of course, above all, crusade against corruption, right? They're going to clean up, they're going to drain you know what. And then they come to power, and then it turns out they are 10 times more corrupt than the old guys. And this is not, speculative sort of reasoning. In some cases, absolutely proven. And as an innocent observer, you would have thought this must be politically deadly. I mean, if your main ticket is to be anti-corruption, and then in government it turns out, you are incredibly corrupt, and everything goes to your son-in-law and family and whatever, that must be the end of the show. And of course, there are many examples where it turns out it's not the end of the show. And something has to explain that. And one explanation might be that from the point of view of supporters, what to outsiders looks like corruption is actually a legitimate way of doing politics. Because whatever they're doing for us, and then maybe the fact that the family gets something too is quite okay. I mean, obviously there are other explanations too. Think of the fact that in so many countries that I politely mentioned a couple of minutes ago, media pluralism has also been radically reduced. So it's not always obvious that everything that outsiders know will be equally known on the inside. At the same time, it also seems to me, this is sort of more anecdotal evidence, not plausible to think that, people are completely cut off from this kind of knowledge. Plenty of people in, let's say, Hungary and Turkey know full well what kind of corruption is going on. This is not like, we're all sort of totally in the dark and there's been some Orwellian brainwashing that everybody has been subjected to. Anyway, there's something to be explained there, and maybe some of you are interested in sort of trying to take up this challenge. Anyway, allow me to mention one last, again, perhaps rather obvious element of the populist art of governance, and it's this. When there is protest against these kinds of regimes, when, in one form or another, civil society tends to act up, populists tend to respond with a strategy that arguably was pioneered by Vladimir Putin at the beginning of the decade at whose end we are now. What I'm talking about is the response that in one way or another always comes down to saying what looks like genuine civil society protest out there is, of course, all manipulated and engineered and paid for by some nefarious, shadowy outside actors and powers. And as you all know, there's a bunch of usual suspects who tend to then turn up on these occasions. The CIA, George Soros, always a favorite, always works, to invoke him. But basically, no limits to creativity in this regard. If you think back, for instance, to the 2013 Gezi Park protests in Istanbul, the government at one point announced that what was happening out there was, of course, not Turkish citizens taking issue with the destruction of Gezi Park. No, obviously, everything had been paid for and engineered by Lufthansa, the German airline. When you think about it, it's obvious why. Turkish Airlines is coming up as a major player in the global airlines industry. Erdogan had just, been started to build this fantastic new airport outside Istanbul, now the greatest and biggest airport in the world. So that's why the Germans basically paid all these protesters. That's why they called everybody into the German embassy before they then went out to confront the genuine Turkish authorities. The interesting thing is that even in cases where this kind of protest clearly is not a genuine threat to a regime, it's very important for these regimes symbolically and morally to delegitimate that protest as comprehensively as possible. And why? Again, I think it has something to do with this core claim of populists that I was trying to make plausible to you at the beginning. If you say that we and only we represent the real people, then by definition, it cannot be true that real citizens are out there protesting against you. That contradiction cannot exist. So the easiest way out is to show to people that these citizens on one level aren't real, They are paid for, they are, so to speak, fake citizens. And that, again, is one reason why it matters, or why one sees a difference between, let's say, a quote-unquote normal democratic government, which, of course, also can react to protest by saying, look, we are elected, and you are just, quote-unquote, civil society, and you're not authorized to overthrow our policies. Of course, we register that you're protesting, but you have to wait till the next election, and then we can talk. That's a perfectly normal response to protest. But that's very different from a response which comes down to somebody saying, or in this case, of course, rather tweeting, that these are all paid-up activists, as Trump did in response to the millions of people who went out to airports and on the streets against the so-called Muslim travel ban. If you say paid-up activists, you, of course, fundamentally deny the legitimacy of people who are making certain political claims. There's no point even in getting into a discussion, because after all, this is just a front. These are fake citizens. Their claims cannot be taken, and should not be taken seriously. Pointing to this populist art of governance is not to say that these regimes are invincible or that somehow nothing can be done. That's not the message. But I do want to push back against this complacent liberal view that the problem of populism somehow, magically, is going to solve itself. I also want to push back against a perhaps not so obvious, I would say, post-end of the Cold War illusion. No, not the end of history. I don't think anybody ever really believed that anyway, but something else. I think there was a strong sense after 1989 that for all their faults, liberal democracies were always going to have what you might call an epistemic advantage. That liberal democracies make mistakes all the time, but we are the only learning system. We are the only self-correcting system. And everybody else, all these authoritarians, are always going to end like the Soviet Union in 1991, because they can't self-correct, they can't learn, they have a kind of epistemic closure which doesn't allow them to do the kinds of things that democracies can do. And I think that has turned out to be an illusion. And one piece of evidence for that is precisely that a lot of these populist regimes are clearly learning from each other. That you can, in a sense, copy parts of this package of a populist art of governance. That somebody figures out how, for instance, you do, a kind of law that effectively disables NGOs, and that at the same time doesn't look on the face of it necessarily so terrible. That's, in a sense, it's in and of itself a certain kind of art form. And, once one government has figured it out, others can copy it and take that somewhere. Again, the lesson is not that therefore these regimes are invincible. But my sense is still that if in doubt, many observers tend to underestimate them. Precisely because there is this sense that they can't learn, they kind of go in an authoritarian direction, and hence it's all bound to fail on its own terms. All right, on that happy note, back to the wave. Last thing I'll say for today. Let me, though, in a sense, preface it, partly because we have more papers this afternoon, which I think get much more into questions of causal explanation, which I already copped out of earlier on in the talk. But let me preface it by saying two things that I think also sometimes nowadays tend to go wrong in the discussion about populism. One thing is that there seems to be an incredible urge to want to find the one global macro cause that explains an allegedly global trend. Now, I'm not saying that's an illegitimate thing to watch out for. At the same time, it's at least slightly ironic that many, again in the broader sense, liberal observers tend to say, oh, populists, the great simplifiers, we live in a complex world and they give us complex, simple solutions and so on. Everything is always so much more complicated, and that's what populists don't understand. And at the same time, we always basically want somebody to explain a supposedly global trend, ideally in 140 characters or less. It's all the economy, it's all cultural anxiety, it's all immigration. And once we found this one thing, then it's all gonna become obvious. Prima facie, it seems to me very plausible to say that national contexts still matter a great deal. and that different scenarios have a lot to do with different national parameters, including one thing that I think is rarely looked at in more detail, which is to say different national cultural parameters. To us, by now, it seems obvious that you can always accuse the elite of being corrupt and so on. But to do that, you actually need to be able to conjure up a plausible image of a homogeneous, corrupt elite. And at the risk of saying the obvious, this is much easier in some contexts than in others. So allow me to give you a totally cliched example. If you tell people in France that all leaders went to the same elementary school in one district in Paris, your audience is going to say, yes, that's empirically actually 90% true. And they're not wrong. That makes it a lot easier to say, look, they're all in it together, they all employ their own families, they all give each other 10,000 euro Armani suits, and so on. You're well on the way to conjuring up something that is likely to gain a certain political traction. If you ask people in Germany, where did our leading politicians go to university, never mind elementary school, most people will not know. Which is, of course, not to say that, there are no elites in Germany. Of course not. But in terms of being able to conjure up, to just press a button and say, here's an image of, that's what our elite looks like and that's why they're corrupt, it's just easier in some places than in others. I'm not saying this is the decisive factor. I'm just in the spirit of a workshop trying to point to something that I think is relatively neglected in discussions today. Second brief, again, more methodological remark, if I may. Part of the problem with the kind of search for here's the one great sort of macro cause, here is the core grievance, be it economic, be it cultural, be it whatever, is that it leaves out the fact that grievances or issues do not present themselves in politics in a kind of unmediated way. They're always mediated by the institutions which ever since the 19th century we thought essential for the functioning of representative democracy, which is to say media and political parties. I agree with Paul Kenny that actually looking at political parties is incredibly important in this context. And it's rarely done by people who write about populism because they simply want to go directly to whatever is then identified as the supposedly most important grievance that is driving this phenomenon. And the kind of mediation part is completely left out. Anyway, let me finally get to the damn wave before time is running out. So why is this such a misleading image? Well, it's misleading because it does suggest that populism is first of all, natural, because waves are natural after all, natural and basically unstoppable process. I mean, who's going to stop a wave, let alone what Nigel Farage, for whom apparently the wave was too sort of tiny as a metaphor given his own world historical importance, as he once put it, a tsunami of populism. Who's going to stop that? Well, nobody, of course. But the image leaves out a couple of rather important elements of the actual political dynamics of the last couple of years. For let's not forget that, for instance, Nigel Farage didn't exactly bring about Brexit all by himself. You all recall that he needed his much more serious, non-populist supporters in the Tory party, who basically communicated to citizens, well, Nigel over there, it's maybe a bit eccentric, but Brexit is a jolly good idea. And you can safely and responsibly vote for that option. So I mean serious politicians like Boris, well, okay, maybe not Boris, but Michael Gove, the man who famously, you all remember maybe, went on British television and said, when confronted by a journalist who said all the experts are against Brexit, famously said, this country has had enough of experts. Which is interesting, not least, because Michael Gove, I think it's fair to say, within the context of British politics, has always been seen as an intellectual, or God forbid, an expert. In other words, it wasn't enough for the person on the street to tell you, experts, it's overrated. It took an expert to tell people that expertise was overrated. Or if you look at the United States, Donald Trump didn't become president as the founder or head of a spontaneous grassroots movement of, as the cliche has it, angry white working class males. No, he was the candidate of a very well-established party. And he also needed serious, no pun intended, heavyweight politicians like Chris Christie, Rudy Giuliani, Newt Gingrich, to basically tell voters, yes, he's a bit eccentric, but he's safe. And he ultimately is our candidate. Again, some of you may remember that rather remarkable moment when Newt Gingrich appeared in the context of the Republican Convention 2016 and was saying that, crime is going through the roof, carnage out there, that's why you have to vote for Trump. And then the reporter confronted him with the fact that all the statistics were pointing in a different direction, that the FBI was actually showing that the opposite was the case. And then Gingrich famously answered, I'm quoting from memory, you may believe in what theorists say. I mean, it's funny in retrospect that at that point, that was the biggest problem these people had with the FBI, that it was full of theorists, but never mind. You may believe in what theorists say. I believe in what people feel. And that, again, is partly interesting because in the context of the American conservative movement, Newt Gingrich is an intellectual. He's a college professor. He writes books about history and also about the future, for good measure. So if somebody like that tells you, trust your instincts, trust what you feel, that's a different thing than somebody, quote unquote, on the street telling you, trust your instincts, trust the way you feel. Long story short, all I'm telling you is that by my reckoning, nowhere in Western Europe or North America have right-wing populists come to power without the cooperation, or even the collaboration, might be the more appropriate word, of very established conservative actors. And that should give us some pause in light of the fact that one typical response by, again, in the broadest sense, liberal observers to the allegedly unstoppable wave of populism has been to say, oh, let's re-empower gatekeepers, okay? The problem is, primaries, let's crazy people and let's, fanatical activists vote. Let's re-empower professional, let's re-empower party elites and so on. In other words, recycling all the cliches of 19th century mass psychology and telling us that there's something wrong with ordinary people, that ordinary people are dangerous and so on. I generally don't believe in these sort of, swift macro sort of analogies with previous eras of history. But for the heck of it, I'll say it anyway. If you look at the 20th century, it's very rare to find instances where, quote unquote, the masses really decided that they were done with democracy. It's elites who decide they're done with democracy. Mussolini didn't march on Rome. Mussolini arrived by sleeper car because he had been invited by existing elites. Hitler didn't need to march on Berlin. He was also invited by existing elites. I'm not saying that these conservative elites, therefore, are like people who brought fascism to power. But the dynamic is important to see. And that's exactly what the wave doesn't allow us to see, because then we look at populism as a kind of isolated phenomenon, and we don't see it as part of this broader political dynamic. Now, obviously, that still leaves a lot to be said about possible trends, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this in the remaining sessions this afternoon. But I think, that's my plea to you, we should be, to put it very mildly, be much more careful with this one particular image/metaphor that comes with a very strong suggestion that, as I've tried hopefully to make plausible to you, is fundamentally false. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Müller. Indeed, he is a political philosopher, and very different from the rest of us who are more empirically inclined. He doesn't use PowerPoint.
Can you say something nice too?
Nice. I'm going to that. And then without the PowerPoint, his lecture is full of power and points. So that's just a good thing, very good thing. I have been lucky to read the paper first. I will make some, what I really learned from reading many essays, books on populism. Of course, mostly non-Asia. First, I think the first lesson I learned actually is the populism, the crux of populism is not anti-establishment. I think that's a very strong message. And anti-establishment, anti-elitism is not dangerous to democracy. That is the basic operation democracy, anti-establishment. Rather, populism is anti-pluralism. That is dangerous to the very nature of democracy. So that is really turn around our image. Second, I think, is the courses of populism in the West is the victims, the massive victims, real victim of globalization. And recent years is the imagined victims of the massive immigrations. And that's our two causes really get mobilized behind, stand behind, and rally behind the populist leaders. And number three, I think I was very curious about, are populist leaders ready to govern? And Professor Mueller said, yes, they are. But the way I want to ask the following question, how do they manage? How they governed? Then by logic, if you promise everything and too easily, it's very not easy to govern. Means you have to promise everything and you have to please everybody and to pay back, and it's easy. So that comes to our empirical question. How many populist government regimes has managed well? And that would be interesting for us to understand. Number four, that's key, very interesting, how to deal with it. I think Professor Mueller said, engage them. Don't avoid them, don't ignore them, to engage them. Let me read the last passage of Professor Mueller's essay. Contrary to what liberals like to believe sometimes, not everything populists say is necessarily demagogical or mendicious, but ultimately their self-representation is based on one big lie, that there is a singular people of which they are the only representatives, the real people. The people behind the populist leader are the real people, and the other people are not the real people, and that is big lie. So therefore, he said, to fight them, one needs to understand, this is very important, and undermine those that claim. That's very important. So, and also in the passage of the paper, don't blame, don't make enemy to those quote-unquote real people. Don't make enemy with those people. And he drew the Hillary Clinton's lessons. Don't ever blame them. Don't throw into the water. 不要把它拖下水. And I think that's important. Now, I will use another 20 seconds to use Taiwan case. Empirically and more microly in Taiwan's case, the populists are very focused on one, dress code, how they wear, how they speak. Somehow this is the way, but in the West, probably not. How they speak, and what can use common language, simple language, easy to understand, and sometimes to us, vulgar languages. Second, very strong mobilization, very keen to mobilize those real people and find means of social media. That's very keen, and then I'm sure in West too. Number three, I think those being hyper-mobilized public, hyper-mobilized the loyal supporters of the populist leader in Taiwan are sometimes not friendly, hostile, and sometimes antagonistic. And I don't know how that happened in country in the West. And because of this hostility, because of the antagonism, and they might urge and also make the other real people not very happy. So that my final end note of the reading is how can we do as a political philosopher to the rise and fall, or the cyclic cycle of the populism in the world? Because here, Professor Mueller's the title is the global wave. Wave is not straight. Wave is like this. So my question is, what would you see the wave go? How would you see the wave turn into? And who can govern? Who can ride those waves? And who will be the winners? Thank you very much. And so now we still have a few minutes. And please, the floor is open. Yes. Can you identify yourself?
Hi, I'm Stephen Zhou from Nanyang Technological University of Singapore. I'm also interested in the development of populism in Europe, America, and also in Asia. But I actually totally agree with you about the definition or the attributes of populism. But however, I find it that a lot of colleagues in Taiwan seem to adopt another approach, that they will see that populism as some sort of defining character of certain people. So they will say that, along with other politicians, they will say that someone is populist and nothing else. That means that we are not populist, or other politicians are not populist. But in my idea is that more or less all these politicians show attributes of populism. For example, they all declare that they stand by the people, that they represent people, right? And then accuse each one another that they do not represent the real people. And another attribute is the anti-intellectualism. They say that, well, how people feel is more important than how the experts feel, or how the experts try to run the world. So how do you think about this? Should we include anti-intellectualism as one of the attributes of populism? And how can we persuade those people who think that the populism is something definite or absolute? Thank you.
Maybe we can pick one more. Please.
So my name is Paul Kenny from the Australian National University. So I just have hopefully a simple question. So if populists are by definition anti-pluralists, how do we then distinguish them from authoritarians or non-democrats? So one approach to populism is to say it's anti-elitism, which to me means, well, that's just democratic. In a sense, like you sort of were saying, I quite agree. But then if we go to the other extreme, which is to say that it's anti-pluralist, does that not also, to some extent, make them also anti-democratic by definition? And where do you sort of draw the line? Is it just a midpoint between the two? Thank you.
We have two questions.
Well, I'm happy to now have three answers to exhaustively, 3 hours to exhaustively answer these simple questions. On the first one, let me say three things very quickly. So I agree, of course, you're totally right, that very often populism simply serves as a kind of swear word in political discourse, and people throw it at each other and so on. There's nothing we can do about that, okay? But it also doesn't mean that we can't try to conceptually, theoretically work on it at the same time, because there are many other words of which this is also true, and we don't just abandon them just because they're also used in this particular form. One thing, though, that maybe is less pedantic and less obvious is that very often both politicians, but also observers, and God forbid also observers in academia, tend to assume that all those who vote for populist parties and candidates, all those citizens, must also somehow be populist. And that doesn't follow. So about the leaders, at least if you find anything, again, worthwhile in what I've been trying to say, we can tell because they talk the way they talk. And yes, you can sometimes say, oh, but other people might talk like this too occasionally. But if you look at the work of, scholars like Keith Hawkins, who've systematically looked at the discourse of someone like Chavez, for instance, it's not true that, everybody sort of talks like this. No, there are distinct differences. in terms of how populist leaders talk and how quote-unquote other leaders talk. But it doesn't follow from that all those who vote for these leaders are necessarily anti-pluralists. And I don't think, at this point anybody still needs to be sort of saying nasty things about Hillary Clinton. But I'll do it anyway. Because it's not actually, contrary to what is so often mentioned, that, it was so horrible that she said deplorables in that famous speech in 2016. With all due respect, a lot of what President Trump says and what some of his followers say is deplorable. Okay? The scandalous part of her speech, in my view, was that she also said, these citizens are irredeemable. Okay? So she basically had decided they're anti-pluralists, they're all racist, they're whatever, and they can be written off. There's no longer worth talking to them, that's it, they're out. That, I think, is fundamentally undemocratic. And she shouldn't have done that. Anyway, on the anti-intellectualism, which was your real question, and it actually slides into an answer to Professor Kenny's question. So populists need to talk about the people. Okay? They need to invoke the people. They need to have a story about the people. And furthermore, the story on one level always, I think, has to be that the people are virtuous and right in whatever then is taken to be the popular will. You can't really be a populist and say, but the people are actually totally mistaken. Only I know what we should be doing, and we should totally ignore what they want. So that sort of builds a bridge to what you were invoking and what I also was kind of invoking a little bit in the talk, namely, okay, common sense gives us the answers, the people always already know the right answers, and so on. But I don't think this necessarily has to play out as a kind of very strong anti-intellectualism, because clearly plenty of populist leaders also have their own intellectuals who say, look, our job, we trust the people are right, and we are kind of there to work up what we take to be the popular will into maybe something somewhat more coherent, and we flesh out how they relate to national traditions or something along these lines. And I think it would be too simple to say, and that's all, per se anti-intellectual. Hence also, but I say this with a certain amount of caution. I'm not saying this is empirically a sound finding, and it goes a little bit to what also interests Paul. I'd be hesitant to say, for instance, that there's a really, really strong connection between populism and denial of climate change. Yes, obviously, a lot of populists have started to say, look, this is all experts telling us things which are not true, and real people know, what's really the case, and so on. But I see this as a relatively contingent outcome of a fact that certain parties at certain points simply opted for this as a strong identification point. So in the US, it's empirically very obvious that people used to be much more all over the place in terms of what they thought about this. Once the Republican Party came out very strongly and said, okay, we stand on this side, their followers basically started to say, to be a good Republican means I'm going to have to take this view, basically, okay? But that's, in many ways, a very contingent outcome. So I'd be cautious with the kind of anti-intellectualism without denying that what you say has opens up maybe an important research agenda. On the authoritarian bit, so you're absolutely right that, in my view, populism has an authoritarian tendency. But not all authoritarianisms are the same. So you can be an anti-pluralist without having to engage in a certain kind of talk about the people. You can be an anti-pluralist and completely devalue the people. So a certain type of religious or theocratic anti-pluralist will say, well, the people are basically sinful and can't be redeemed, and so on. We, as, let's say, a small elite of the enlightened, we have to take highly authoritarian measures to purify the people, and so on. So there you are with a strongly authoritarian stance, but you don't say anything positive about the people. Or, historically, I think it would be hard to maintain that Lenin was a kind of pluralist guy. I mean, it was very clear that the vanguard knows what's what. Here we have a highly trained cadre of specialists in revolutionary theory, and the people, forget about them. At most they're going to get to trade union consciousness, but they need somebody to tell them what's what. Very anti-pluralist, but not really populist. Or an old-style bureaucratic authoritarianism that basically came to power with a quasi-technocratic claim. People are irrational. Especially in Latin America, a sort of pushback against populists in the sort of, in my view, misguided economistic sense of, irresponsible demagogues who promised people, inflation or whatever. And now we're going to have responsible government, but the people need to be pushed out of politics. So very authoritarian, but says nothing positive about the people. So I know this is a very simplistic answer on one level, but I think if we take the people and populism seriously, and I think we have to, then there needs to be that kind of claim somewhere. And you can be an authoritarian without ever sort of making that claim.
I think time is up. I'm very sorry to say that. Very much true. I think the anti-pluralism has also a tendency, and that is danger to democracy, not the anti-establishment. I think I also share this very strong, powerful message. Thank you very much. I usually not cliche. I learned a lot, and I confirm some of my doubt and questions. And please join me to thank Professor Muller. And then I'm sure the organizer has something to say.
We continue this discussion on populism at 8th floor, room 802. So you are very welcome, and it starts at 2 o'clock. So we'll have Professor Kenny, 吴杰明老师，还有 Nathan Bato, Lin Zonghong, He Mingxiu, and myself. And we will keep on providing, I hope, a little bit more empirical evidence from a sociological perspective. Thank you very much.
We're in the middle of
I'm supposed to take a picture.
不好意思，学会这边有希望留一张合照，所以如果没有赶时间，可以帮我往中间靠拢。